For those of you who may have just arrived, I want to welcome you to today's presentation, the Zamorano Press and Printing in Mexican California. I think we're going to just maybe wait one more minute before we get started, just to make sure everyone can capture the full program. So sit tight and we'll get started soon. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. I am Jose Guerrero, and on behalf of the Bibliographical Society of America, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Zamorano Press and Printing in Mexican California. We're joined today by moderator Kirsten Silva Gruesz and panelists Gerald Cloud, Gary Kurutz, and Teresa Salazar. Before we begin, let me remind you that this event is being recorded and that by participating, you are agreeing to abide by the BSA Events Code of Conduct. And I'm going to post a link to that code of conduct in the chat just now. The BSA conducts its business on the traditional and ancestral lands and waters of the Lenape people in Lenapehoking in Brooklyn, New York. I am streaming from El Cerrito, California, the traditional lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. The Society gathers together at events like this one across the North and South American continents on the traditional and ancestral lands and waters of indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from their lands. We acknowledge the exclusion and erasures of indigenous peoples in the places where we work and gather, and we encourage you to type your local land acknowledgement into the moderated chat on your screen and share it with our community. This event is being closed captioned by a live captioner in English, with a machine-generated translation of those captions in Spanish. I'm sharing a link for Spanish captions now in the chat. And let me get that open for you all. Okay. I'd like to thank our captioner for their work in making this event accessible. Today's event will conclude with a question and answer period. To submit a question to our speakers, please enter it into the question and answer box, which is on the bottom portion of the Zoom window. All attendees can see, comment on, and upvote questions, and we ask that you do this to help us, let us know questions that are of interest to today's audience. We also encourage you to engage in conversation using Zoom's chat feature during today's talk. However, if you submit a question via the chat, we will ask that you re-enter it into the Q&A box just so we make sure we have all the questions in one place. And last but not least, before we begin, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors and donors Via Libri and Getman's virtual book fairs for joining us today and helping to make this event possible. And without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Kirsten Silva Gruesz, Professor of Literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who will introduce today's session and speakers.
Thank you, Jose, and thanks especially to Erin McGurl, who's been so intrepid in putting together this great program for Bibliography Week. My name is Kirsten Silva Gruesz. I'm a professor of literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz, with a special interest in the history of Spanish language print culture in the US and its significance for Latinx populations today. And I want to welcome you all to this session y ofrezco un saludo amistoso a nuestros colegiados hispanohablantes. Jose Figueroa's 1835 Manifesto a la República Mexicana is fairly well known to students of the period. It's a lengthy defense by an early provincial governor of Alta California of his actions in response to the sudden arrival of a group of colonists sent by the Central Mexican government to rein in some of the established Californians' local practices. As a primary text, it's significant enough to merit this authoritative edition prepared by a historian in 1978. But as a book object, the Manifesto signifies something else. At 184 pages, it's by far the most ambitious production of the single printing press in the region at this time, a press run by one Agustin Zamorano, who would later be immortalized in the naming of the Zamorano Club, an early 20th century group of book collectors. Indeed, the bibliophile who produced the limited edition on the right described its value thus. The Manifesto was the important book printed in Alta California during the Spanish occupation, which is a strange turn of phrase, is now reaching for the status of Tamerlane and the Bay's Psalm. Now, I'll wager that most of you in the audience will recognize these references to, on the one hand, Poe's super rare first book of poems, and on the other, to the first English book published in North America. Both are legendarily sought after and reverentially preserved. But I'd also wager that few of you had heard of Figueroa's Manifesto, at least prior to registering for this panel. What does that say about the unspoken geographical and linguistic norms of American, that is, US national book history, and all the other fields that branch out from it? Is this particular first less well known to you because it's from the Pacific margin or because it's in Spanish? I'm so delighted today to bring you a dream team of folks to lead us on a voyage of discovery about this suggestive object. We'll be going around the circle of our panelists twice, so this will go at a good clip. Let me introduce them now so that we can have plenty of time for Q&A. First, we have Teresa Salazar, who has been the curator of the Bancroft collection, Western Americana, since 1999. She regularly teaches students from UC Berkeley and other campuses about conducting research in the Bancroft Library. She's contributed articles to numerous books and journals and has organized many exhibitions at the Bancroft, including co-curating exhibitions on the first 100 years of Save the Redwoods League, Guerra Civil at 80, and the creation of the Panama Canal and the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Prior to her time at the Bancroft, she was Special Collections Librarian at the University of Arizona Library. She's also worked in the Prints and Photographs Division of the New York Public Library and the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress. She has an MLS from Columbia University and an MA in English Literature from the University of New Mexico. Next, we'll be hearing from Gary F. Kurutz, who was for 31 years the principal librarian of the Special Collections Branch of the California State Library in Sacramento. After his retirement, he served as executive director of the State Library Foundation until 2018. Previously, he held positions as head librarian at the Sutro Library, library director at the California Historical Society, and bibliographer of Western Americana at the Huntington Library. He's also a past president of the Book Club of California, chairing its publications committee for nearly 20 years. He's written several books and over 200 articles, keepsakes, introductions, and forewords concerning California history and Western Americana, including a just completed descriptive bibliography of the Klondike and Alaskan gold rushes. He remains on the faculty at the California Rare Book School. For those extraordinary contributions to the field, far too extensive to list here, he's received many awards and honors, including most recently the Hubert Howe Bancroft Award from the Friends of the Bancroft Library. And finally, we have Gerald W. Cloud, who is an antiquarian bookseller based in Sonoma County, California. He earned his PhD in literature from the University of Delaware in 2005 and published John Rodker's Ovid Press, a bibliographical history, in 2010. He served as a curator and librarian at Columbia University, at the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library at UCLA, and the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, Austin. He's also worked in the antiquarian book trade for James Cummins Bookseller in New York City. He's taught descriptive bibliography at California Rare Book School at UCLA since 2013. So Teresa, please lead us off.
Okay, first, I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping everybody can see that. So I want to begin by talking about how the press first got to Monterey. So So George L. Harding in Don Agustin v. Zamorano, statesman, soldier, craftsman, and California's first printer, provides the best researched account of the arrival of the press into California. Listed on an invoice dated May 20th, 1833, as part of a cargo sent on the ship Lagodas. We see a contemporary photo and a model of the ship on your screen, is the following: case, printing press, type, and apparatus complete. The master, Captain John Bradshaw, and supercargo Captain Thomas Shaw had traveled the shipping route to California before. Harding summarizes the voyage as follows. The Lagoda, after the voyage around Cape Horn, arrived in Honolulu in the Sandwich Islands about October 1st, 1833. She sailed again for Monterey in Alta California on November 8th. So while we don't know the exact date that the ship arrived on the California coast, the ship was in Monterey in June 1844, and it appears that the press was delivered by that point. The Lagoda transported a Ramage press and type, which has been identified as small Paiga number 1 of the Boston Type and Stereotype Foundry in Massachusetts. The arrival in 1833 of Governor Jose Figueroa has the appointment of Agustin Zamorano as his secretary. He is the first person to oversee the press, which essentially begins its life as a government press, mainly used to print proclamations, announcements, etc. Zamorano is quick to set up the press and to get to work, with the earliest evidence of the printing press being a printed heading to a manuscript document dated July 28th, 1834. Zamorano controlled the press from June of 1834 to November 6, 1836. Aviso Publico, seen here to the left, is a notice to the public of the opening of the press, dated and signed Monterey 1834, Imprenta de Zamorano, and includes the costs for having the work done on the press. This copy of the aviso is part of the Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo collection. He will later take that press up to Sonoma. The second piece on the right is an official document from the government of Jose Figueroa, printed in Monterey on August 6, 1834, and delineates the ways and means to gather public funds for councils and other offices run by the government. Both these broadsides are executed in a very utilitarian way, with no leading between the lines, perhaps because of the scarcity of paper, but more likely that the person doing the press work was not a skilled printer. Also, the type that was sent did not include italics or accented characters, and thus those were either ignored or supplied in a creative way, which Gerald will talk about in just a few minutes. The Reglamento Provincial seen here is significant because it is the small 16-page pamphlet. It is the longest text printed on this press until Figueroa's Manifesto. The text recounts the rules and regulations adopted by the territorial legislature for the government's organization and deliberations. After Figueroa's death, the press remains in Monterey under Zamorano's control until November 1836, but is transferred into the hands of a variety of people after that, reflective of the government disruption in Alta California. Harding notes that the different printers, a different printer begins operating the press in January 1836 after Figueroa's death. The press is still in the hands of Zamorano. The piece to the left is a proclamation from Jose Castro, acting governor of California. Harding describes this work as follows. The text of these proclamations consists of only 2 or 3 short paragraphs, but they were set with skill and imagination. Their lines were leaded, and they were pleasingly placed on the sheet. And their press work was much superior to that of any piece printed before them. The proclamation to the right relates to revolt against Governor Juan Alvarado and addresses the unrest and fears of civil war among the people. General Guadalupe Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo is the commander of the army, and he supports his nephew, Alvarado, in quelling this unrest. The heading and decorative ornament are wood blocks, and the piece is centered and well printed. The press is still in Monterey, but Vallejo will soon move it to Sonoma, where he will begin printing, as one might expect, many political and governmental texts. However, I do want to note that there's other output from this press beyond those political and military imprints. For instance, they did print things like school books, 6 of them in total. And here we see the tablas printed by Zamorano for helping children learn arithmetic. Some of those educational books are also, or pamphlets are actually printed by Vallejo as well. In addition, he produces the first known medical book in California, his Botica. So I'm going to turn this now over to Gerald, who's going to talk a little bit about the Manifesto.
Thanks, Teresa. While I'm getting my screen ready, I just want to say thanks to the BSA and also to my fellow panelists. I'm really honored to be included with this group and hope I can carry my weight here. And getting the PowerPoint to work is the first important step. Okay, let's look briefly at how this book was made. Because of the pandemic, I have not actually been able to see a physical copy of this book. So I'm relying on digital copies, of which there are 4 different ones available, and George Harding's concise description in his Zamorano biography. The Manifesto was printed on a Ramage common press like this one. The press could accommodate a sheet large enough to print the Manifesto as an octavo based on the individual page size. Now, it's inconclusive based on the images that I've seen, but the book appears to have vertical chain lines. The book itself is composed of 49 two-leaf gatherings. Harding tells us that the sheets were not printed and then folded, but rather that the sheets were printed and then cut before binding into the two-leaf gatherings. I'm not sure how he came to that conclusion, but in this image of the Beinecke's copy in original wrappers, you can see that 1, the top edge is very neatly trimmed, and 2, looking at the spine where the wrapper is absent, we see there are indeed many, many folds. So some evidence that supports Harding's account without even seeing the book. Considering this information, we can imagine that the printer was using half sheets of paper, but that he imposed the pages on the press as one does for a half sheet of quarto for work and turn. Stick with me. This would efficiently accommodate Harding's account of the book's structure and result in an easy way to produce two-leaf gatherings. Harding notes that the paper was Italian handmade with a watermark. So close examination of the paper evidence, once one is able to see actual copies, would obviously tell us more definitively about the format and the imposition. The book itself is 184 pages. It's unsigned and stab sewn. Here we can see the sewing holes. This is the Historical Society's copy. And as Teresa mentioned, the type came from Boston, small pica #1. Unfortunately, this meant that there were no accented sorts that are necessary for Spanish language printing. The printer accommodated the ñ by altering a F ligature. There's an FI at lower right, which would have been altered by filing down part of the ascender. So notice also the lowercase n that's here is different from the ñ in Signora. And if we superimpose that ligature over the ñ, you can kind of see how they made this happen. But the book was very much a pioneer press production. In this slide, you can see the difference in the inking between sheets. The right-hand page being much muddier than the left. This is a split between sheets here, or the two-leaf gatherings. Here's a closer view of the rather messy result. Notice too that the sheet has not been perfected precisely, and you can see the page number 9 showing through above the page number 10. The book included an errata, and it lists some typographical errors, as well as some Spanish-English language spelling conflicts, which I thank Kirsten for pointing out. Regarding the distribution of the book, I don't know too much at this point, but the slide you're seeing here is Nicolas Gutierrez, who succeeded Governor Figueroa after his death, sent this cover letter out with copies of the book. The cover letter was printed on the Zamorano press and announces the Manifesto and its purpose. It's dated April 1836. The copy you see here is from the California Historical Society. It formerly belonged to George Harding, and it must have been discovered by him after he did his census of the Spanish imprints. It's the only copy known, and the English translation you see there on the left is from a Zamorano keepsake. A facsimile was made with an English language translation in 1969. So that's an overview of how the book was made. And I will turn it over to Gary.
Okay, need to impose upon our wonderful coordinator to load up my slides. If that can be done, please stand by. There we go. Okay, I'm talking about the Zamorano Press after the American invasion and its journeys through several cities in Northern California. And of course, it was first witnessed by Walter Colton and a couple of other people. They heard about a press in Monterey, and they located the press and said that there was an opportunity here to print an English language newspaper. They felt with the American takeover, that was essential. And of course, we have a slide of the actual press and the Ramage press that we've seen before. We'd like to go to the next slide too, to show there's the volume 1, number 1 of the Californian. And again, they were fortunate and they had an English language typeface rather than Spanish. And again, this was done by Walter Colton and Robert B. Semple. And Semple was a very skilled printer too. He's noteworthy too back then because he stood about 6 feet 6 inches in height, and people made a lot of jokes about him and how his pants could not go further than his knees because they were just too short, and his feet scraped along the ground when he's on a horse. He is so tall. And if we could have the next slide here too, we have the person, Edward C. Kimball, and Edward Gilbert took over the Californian. And we owe a lot to Kimball because he produced a history of printing in California during the American period up to 1856. And the Kimball collection of the California Historical Society is named in his honor, but he was very important in researching the history of the early printing in California and the presses. And so if we go on to the next slide here. Thank you. The press began its journeys from Monterey. They went up to San Francisco, or as was called back then. There was a gentleman there by the name of Sam Brannan, who was a Mormon. He was sent by Brigham Young to establish a newspaper in what was called Yerba Buena, or San Francisco. But he also heard about the Zamorano press, and they got together and they printed the California Star, which was San Francisco's first newspaper. But you can see San Francisco, this is actually very sophisticated growth. At first, it was just a handful of tents willy-nilly spread around the city. But after they got the first newspaper going in San Francisco, Samuel Brannan had the idea of taking the press up to Sacramento. And so he loaded it on board the ship, and it took 8 days to get from San Francisco to Sacramento and at Sutter's Fort. And there it was sent up to print that city's very first newspaper, the Placer Times. And this is the very first newspaper in the gold country. And here's one issue of it. They're always talking about the latest news. One thing that was very common about San Francisco, as you can see in this illustration, is they had 7 fires in the early 1850s that destroyed so much documentation and literature. But anyhow, this Placer Times was the first one in the interior of California. But there are other areas with the discovery of gold. California is growing incredibly fast. And actually they said that one comment by Kemble is that this is the suicide place for newspapers because so many were started and stopped. But with Kemble's expertise and Sam Brannan, they moved the press down to Stockton, California. And if we could actually have the next slide here. There it is, the beautiful port city of Stockton, which is south of Sacramento. Also, it's called Old Tulleyburg, and there they started the Stockton Times. And it was a very important newspaper for getting the word out as to what was going on with the Americanization of California. And they used the original Zamorano press to do this printing. And it again is fascinating how it, it started another newspaper. Many newspaper firsts were handled by the Zamorano press. And then from there, they learned that the first city to host the press was Sonora in Tuolumne County. And there, the Zamorano press was used to print the first paper in the gold country. And Sonora was called the Queen of the Southern Mines. And so, but there was another city further south called Columbia. And it also hosted the press to print its first newspaper, the Columbia Gazette. And one of the unfortunate things that happened, though, is that there was news that the press was going to be transported elsewhere, and they were getting it ready. And they started taking it apart, and they took the main frame of the press out into the main street of Columbia. And some vandals had the idea, well, we'll teach them a lesson, and they set the poor press on fire. This great relic of California printing history was set on fire in Columbia. However, the people of Sonora heard about this, and they're able to get the press back to Sonora. But unfortunately, even though it was badly charred, and even though, like I said, it was badly burnt, they started to try to put it back together. However, Sonora suffered from many fires, and the press was lost in a great fire in Sonora. And that was the end of one of the great relics, if you will, artifacts of California history and printing history. There's so many people along the way, as the press was transferred, recognized its historical value. And they said, one commented, we need to build a museum with the press as the centerpiece of our museum. But that did not happen. So we'll move right on there, and you can see in Columbia there. And one of my heroes I got to know when I was the library director of the California Historical Society was George L. Harding. And we'll probably talk about him later, but he did this wonderful biography of Zamorano. And he established the Kemmel collection at the Historical Society devoted to printing history. And he was able to track down that there was an actual portrait made of Zamorano. This is a self-portrait that you see here However, that was lost in a fire, but fortunately, again, another fire consuming these great important artifacts. But the person who had the painting actually commissioned to have a photograph made of it, and that survived. And that's why we have this very good image of Zamorano. And again, California's very first printer. And there's Mr. Harding. And he was a great businessman, but also a fabulous book collector, and established, as I mentioned before, the Kemble or collection, named for Edward Kemble, the first historian of the California press, built a fabulous, fabulous collection. And that is still with the California Historical Society. And I had the unfortunate circumstance of presiding at his memorial service in 1976, but he was truly a remarkable historian and so devoted to the history of print culture in California. And that's my segment there, and I tried to cover a lot of ground, so we can have some questions later on. So, thank you.
And so I'm coming back and I'm going to share my screen again. Let's see. So while we're focusing on the Zamorano press, it's important that we look at the broader context of what was going on in the 1830s and 40s on what was the northern frontier of Mexico, now what we call the American Southwest. So Mexico had received its independence from Spain in 1820. In New Spain, there had been tight control, not only on the press, but also trade and interchange. With the coming of Mexican independence from Spain in 1821, the central government's control diminished. Thus, on the California coast, Anglo-Americans developed an intensive trade with California via ships sailing around the Horn, much as we have seen with the ship Lagoda. There is active trading with foreigners who are eager to trade their cargo for hides and other goods available in California. In a similar situation in New Mexico, after Mexican independence, the Santa Fe Trail is opened, beginning legal international trade. In July of 1834, the first printing press arrives in New Mexico. So this is the second of the Mexican presses active in the continental US. Trader Josiah Gray mentions the press in his book, Commerce of the Prairies. He brought a similar wood and iron ramage press, and the type can be traced back to the same Boston foundry. The initial owner of the press was Ramon Abreu, who was the territorial secretary of New Mexico. And his printer is Jesus Maria Baca from Durango, Mexico. To the right, you can see a list of citizens who could serve as jurors for trials related to freedom of the press, libel, and other matters. And the press was initially in Santa Fe. And one of the productions was a newspaper called El Crepúsculo de la Libertad, or the Dawn of Liberty. Within a year of its arrival, Padre Antonio Jose Martinez, an influential priest and educator, acquired the press and moves it to Taos, New Mexico. A controversial figure in his time, he was at odds with Archbishop Lamy in Santa Fe, and eventually this leads to his excommunication from the church. He is the source of the much maligned renegade priest in Willa Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop. Padre Martinez, after the death of his wife, goes to Durango, Mexico to study for the priesthood. While he is there in the seminary, he is imbued with the Enlightenment ideas of the time, including the need to broaden education among the people. He opened a school in Taos that included education for both girls and boys, and he worked with students preparing for the seminary. On New Mexico's first press, he printed, as you would expect, political and religious texts, as well as textbooks for his school. including what is considered New Mexico's first book, this grammar book called Cuaderno de Ortografía. Jesus Maria Baca continues to be the consistent printer throughout the Mexican period, and right as an opening of the Cuaderno, along with another book of Martinez's of Spanish dictionary. So the only press in the region was used by General Stephen Watts Kearny to print the Kearny Code, laws established by the Americans for the newly occupied territory of New Mexico after the end of the Mexican-American War. During the Mexican period, the government also issued two newspapers, La Verdad and El País de Nuevo Mexico, from this same press. Many of the educated citizens of Alta California and Nuevo Mexico were caretakers of and emissaries of their culture. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo preserved official and private documents, which he would later give to Hubert Howe Bancroft, and he produced a 5-volume testimonial for Bancroft. This is a manuscript. Vallejo was not only well educated himself, but educated his children, both female and male. Figueroa's Manifesto is an important treatise where he justifies his point of view and his actions. As C. Allen Hutchinson states, Figueroa felt it necessary to put his case for the public in a normal way employed by other prominent persons in Mexico. A ringing manifesto pointing out the errors of his opponents and the righteousness of his own actions. Mexicans often faced condescension, condemnation, and antipathy from Americans coming into the territory, especially after the Mexican-American War. But I would argue that these two presses, though their output is modest and limited, were used actively by their various operators. So we have come to reevaluate what was the intent and contribution of these individuals. E. Boyd, who worked at the Museum of New Mexico and focused her career on the preservation of New Mexican folk art, states in an article, the first imprint, New Mexico imprint, hindsight gives credit to Cura Martinez for his resistance against foreign Catholicism that condemned regional architecture, art, and religious observance. Many believe that people like Martinez not only stood in opposition to the demeaning of their culture and to society, allowed these emblems and evidence of their culture to be preserved. So I also want to mention that the loss of much documentation from the Spanish and Mexican period makes it difficult for us to tell these stories. This is especially true for California because of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. In the ferocious fires that engulfed the city, the archives of California, which are the official records of the Spanish and Mexican government in Alta California, these were lost along with almost every other library within the city, with the exception of the Bancroft Library, which was outside the fire line. So I'm going to now turn it over to Gerald once again.
Gerald, could you unmute, please?
That's a great idea, unmuting. It makes for a better presentation. Well, it depends. We'll see. I'm going to pick up right where Teresa left off and try to answer, if I can make my thing work, try to answer, well, what happened after Zamorano going forward in terms of Californiana and book collecting. As early as 1855, we know of at least 5 or 6 contemporary collectors who owned copies of the Manifesto. There was real interest among scholars and book collectors in the Spanish press, even though the broadsides and the ephemera was quite scarce. Hubert Bancroft began collecting in 1859, and by the 1880s, He reported a detailed knowledge of Spanish publishing in his History of California. Very detailed, I learned when working on this. The bibliographer Robert Cowan continued research into the history of printing in California, publishing his Spanish Press of California in 1902. Cowan even identified a few discoveries that had escaped Bancroft. He also reports on the rarity of the Spanish press items, citing the Bancroft collection, the State Library collections, and the Surveyor General's office as repositories, the latter being the one that Teresa just mentioned as having been lost. And you have to see a picture of the earthquake, or else it's just not a California presentation on the early 20th century. In 1906, the city was left in ruins after the great earthquake and subsequent fire. But Bancroft's library was stored, as I've understood, also in a fireproof building, and thus it survived to become part of the University of California, and this was its first home on campus. San Francisco rebuilt very quickly, and by 1912, only 6 years after the earthquake, the Book Club of California is established. The club's first publication was Cowan's seminal work, A Bibliography of the History of California and the Pacific West, in 1914. Cowan's important bibliographical work gave collectors the kind of resource they would need when building their own collections and doing historical research. In 1927, a group of Los Angeles collectors determined that a new club should be named for the first printer in California, and thus the Zamorano Club was founded. Both clubs maintained a publishing program and continue to be strong advocates for the collecting and study of California and Californiana. When the Zamorano members decided to publish a list of must-have titles on the history of California, the Zamorano 80, a selection of distinguished California books, was published in 1945. The club described the list as follows. Our emphasis has been on distinguished books, not books of great rarity. We do not make any claim that our selection includes the 80 most important books in the field, but those books which we believe should be cornerstones of any real collection of Californiana. The list includes titles focused on Spanish, Mexican, and early statehood periods, so naturally Jose Figueroa's Manifesto is included. In 2010, the Zamorano Select, a companion volume to the Zamorano 80, was published. This collection of bibliographical essays covers 120 significant books in California history, which picks up after 1870. So that is a fast and brief look at what happened post-Zamorano going forward. And I am turning it over now to Gary again.
Okay, well, thank you, Gerald. Just wanted to share with the group a little commentary of showing the sometimes rivalry between newspapers. And the Californian, the first newspaper, took note of the establishment of another paper in San Francisco called the California Star. And this is what they said about that. The press, we have received the first 2 numbers of the new paper just commenced at Yerba Buena. It is issued upon a small but very neat sheet at $6 per annum. It is published and owned by Sam Brannan, the leader of the Mormons, who was brought up by Joe Smith himself and is consequently well qualified to unfold and impress the tenets of his sect. The California Star did take note of this commentary, and its editor responded with vigor. Said, "We have received 2 late numbers of the Californian, a dim, dirty little paper printed at Monterey on the worn out material of one of the old California war presses, the Ramage Press. It is published and edited by Walter Colton and Robert Semple, The one Colton, a lying sycophant, and the other Semple, an overgrown lickspittle. And again, the talk of Semple being overgrown was because of his 6 feet 6 inch height. And just as I think kind of fascinating, some of the interchange with these early newspapers. But it, and as Gerald pointed out so well, the legacy left by Zamorano through the various bibliographies too is very, very important to bring out. And I had the pleasure of actually writing the introduction to the new Zamorano Select a long time ago, but it just shows you how devoted so many book collectors are in California to preserving the heritage of the pioneer press in California. And only, I just keep thinking, if only that press had survived. One thing that you continue to hear about the fires that ravaged San Francisco, particularly in 1906, but also other natural disasters like fires in Sonora. And in Sacramento, it's fortunate that the press arrived later because early in 1850, they had a terrible flood that just about wiped out the entire city. And it was a good thing that Zamorano Press was not in Sacramento at that time. It arrived about 6 months later. So anyhow, those are just little anecdotes that I've run across in my time, studying these wonderful, wonderful artifacts and documents of California history. So I'd like to turn it back to our dear chairperson too. If Kirsten is available. Hello.
So the question that remains for us, though, is what happened to all the copies of the Manifesto? And Gerald has some really brand new research and information created just for this panel. So I'll turn it back to Gerald.
Okay, I'm not muted this time, so this will be smoother. As I'm switching over, I have to say how grateful I am to all of the librarians, booksellers, and collectors that I communicated with, the generosity of their responses. And I'm sure that I was bumped forward in the queue several times. So thank you. There's an acknowledgement slide at the end. I couldn't, too many people to name. When I agreed to participate in this panel, I thought working up a good knowledge of the physical book would be easy. There are 5 copies of this book within 50 miles of where I live. The pandemic changed that, of course. However, with that generous support that I received, it made the following a lot easier. So when I started my investigation, I started with OCLC, where I saw that there were over 35 copies recorded, a number that surprised me because I knew the book to be rare. However, investigation showed that more than half of these copies are erroneously linked to the Newbery's digital copy of the book and not a copy of the book itself. It's not a Newbery glitch, it's an OCLC glitch. This only fueled my interest. So spontaneously, I set out to find as many copies as I could and to confirm holdings. My goal being to sort out a more accurate number of extant copies. Now, previous scholarship on the book includes Robert Cowan's 1919 Bibliography of the Spanish Press, where he lists 4 copies. George Harding, we have to mention again because he did a census in 1933 of Spanish imprints. He identifies 11 copies, 5 in libraries and 5 privately owned. But there are mysteries here. Bancroft is said to have 3 copies, but the Bancroft didn't get their 3rd copy until 1964, although they have a photographic copy, photographic reproduction from 1939 in their collection. So we start to see a little bit of wobble, even for a good scholar like Harding. 3 of the copies listed here, Templeton Crocker, Joseph Fauntleroy, and Streeter, I haven't precisely located, but let's go forward. Greenwood in 1962 did California Imprint's Bibliography, not a census, and he lists 7 copies. We notice the absence of the Templeton Crocker copy, but the presence of the Streeter copy. The San Francisco bookseller John Windle directed me to a key piece of information in a 1982 catalog for John Howell books, in which Howell had identified 19 copies of the Manifesto. But Howell did not kiss and tell, and the specific owners of the copies are not accounted for in his description. Now, significant books are often the subject of a census: Gutenberg, Shakespeare, Copernicus, Newton, Whitman, etc. And as bibliographers, we understand the vital importance of seeing as many copies of a book as we possibly can when attempting to contextualize and understand the book's importance. The physical evidence, such as annotations, ownership marks, condition, and other evidence, reveal details about the book's significance that cannot be understood in any other way. So in my preliminary effort to locate copies of Figueroa's Manifesto, I was able to make the following observations. I have located 19 copies of the book with a slight asterisk, but I have no way to know if they're the same 19 that Warren Howell discovered in 1982. 14 of the copies are in institutions. 5 of the copies are in private hands, although the Streeter, Clifford, and Volkman copies, I don't precisely have the whereabouts identified yet. Copy 20 with a question mark, Templeton Crocker, ambiguously recorded, but recorded multiple times from reliable sources. More than half, 11 of the 19, are in California or Mexico. There are no copies at the JCB, John Carter Brown at Brown University, none at Clements at the University of Michigan, and none at the University of Texas, either Benson or the HRC. My notes conflict with the slide. Since 1959, only 5 copies have been offered at auction. And a couple of interesting things I wanted to point out. The original condition that have recorded the copies in, 7 of 19 in original wrappers. And most of the other copies are in original bindings or a modest binding. There's no Morocco or bibliophile bindings that I've seen so far. And a minor note on the errata, I compared the errata list to all 4 digital copies. I found no stop press corrections, but I did find 3 errors in the errata, which was kind of funny. Provenance, very interesting. The provenance of the book is significant for historical participants in early Mexico, California, including colonists, a governor, a bishop, leading and influential pioneer families, likely due to Gutierrez's distribution of the books. Ownership later, starting in the 1850s, by the first generation of collectors of Californiana, and also early holdings in California repositories. Really, for me, marking a significant recognition of the book's value, both for its linguistic and its historic content, as well as an interest in it as an object or an artifact. The goal for going forward for me, just quickly here, I plan to see all the copies, collate them, record the bindings, inscriptions, and so forth, and try to track as much of the provenance as possible. And it's possible with this book because the book has been a star since it's been recorded as being sold in places. Back to the late 19th century, I found auction records so far. So I think it's traceable. Here's the list. of the 19 or question mark 20 copies. And I wanted to just look quickly at a few copies before we get to the Q&A. This copy is at the is in the Seaver collection, the LA County Museum of Natural History, owned by the Coronel family. They were colonists. They were part of the Hiyar Padres group. I don't know which colony they were in, but they were. This is probably the first owner of this book. And interestingly, you can see the sewing holes on this hardcover binding are the same as the earlier sewing holes that we saw, suggesting that maybe some of the copies were bound in hardcover. This is a great copy. It's the sort of all-star provenance copy with pioneer families, a governor of California, the Archbishop of San Francisco, and then kind of the cream of the crop of California collectors in the early part of the 20th century. Most recently, this was the Volkman copy that sold in 2003. And Volkman was one of only 4 private collectors to have ever assembled a complete Zamorano 80 list. Again, I have to show the distribution letter because I find it so fascinating. This is the SMU copy. 3 owners within 10 years of each other, less than 10 years, all in the 1850s, are recorded in this copy that's now at SMU. Bancroft copies, you have the Vallejo copy on the left, which is, they were a family living in Monterey in the 1830s. You know, probably this I'm imagining, could have been handed to one of the family members when it was distributed. And then the other Bancroft copy, their copy 3, which is here in original wrappers. This is the Nuevo Leon copy, which is fully digitized online, and they photographed this clipping that's in the book. So the University of Nuevo Leon is in the state of Monterrey, Mexico, and this has the clipping from the San Francisco Chronicle in 1920, talking about the sale in New York of the Dunlap collection, where the copy of this book was sold, not the Nuevo Leon copy. The Dunlap copy is the Volkman copy. So it's interesting how this got there and why it was kept. It's interesting, I think. Finally, if anybody knows of copies that I have not accounted for, I was going to put a milk carton, but I didn't have time for the graphic. And the acknowledgements are here again. So many people helped. I'm just going to leave that slide up for a moment. And those of you who are watching, if you see your name up there, again, thank you very much for your help. And that is a quick run through of the findings that I have. I guess I'll stop sharing, but thank you again to everybody who helped respond to my questions.
Thank you so much, Gerald. And we're officially out of time, but if people don't mind staying for a little bit, we do have some questions from the audience. One is, are there any noteworthy features of California bookbinding in this period in terms of materials or techniques? And Gerald, your observation about the sewing and your speculation about that that binding might be particular to it. But Gary and Teresa, maybe you have some other thoughts, or Gerald, do you have any other insights about that question?
I am not an early California binding specialist, so I will just be quiet.
Likewise, it'd be a good subject to investigate, though. It really would be.
And there's another question about Zamorano's personal involvement in the moves of the press to different locales. And so Gary was trying to establish how once the press leaves the hands of the Spanish-Mexican population, then it goes on to have a whole new life in terms of the pioneer press in the English language newspaper world. But this is all retraced in George Harding's magnificent work, which is on our bibliography that I can put up here too. And there was another question about how we source the typesetting labor in each place, which I don't know if Gary or Teresa, you want to recap what we do and don't know about who was actually doing that work.
But we do know that Zamorano actually pretty much leaves, you know, when the press is goes out of his hands, he goes back to eventually to Mexico, and then he comes back very briefly for another appointment, but then dies very soon after that in I think San Diego. But then it does go into various people's hands. I mainly know about Vallejo, but Gary, you might know who else had that. The Mexican press. Well,
with Sam Brannon, he certainly was involved, and again, the original type that came to Monterey was English language, so he took that over into do printing for his the library or the Mormon Church, and he also helped sponsor the printing of in other gold rush towns. But in each place, usually the editor of that particular newspaper was in charge of setting the type. It was kind of, many of these early newspapers were 1 or 2 person operations. And so they had to be very versatile in not only printing skills, but setting the type and then distribution, and also writing the text for a lot of these things too. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it shows you, what a complex world it was to get a newspaper out too. So.
And there's another question that follows on that. Wouldn't the type have worn out, or were there actually not that many pieces printed? And we do know of a couple of resupplies of type, correct? First to Zamorano and then later.
Right, so I think by that, when I mentioned that second printer, so that actually, I think there is a new type that printer is using. And then also on the Vallejo piece, I think there's a piece that's the printer's actually credited as Santiago Aguilar. So I think there is a name of the printer at that point. But again, I think there is not enough evidence of like who was actually setting the type for most of the pieces.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And so there's also a question about Kemble, people mentioning that they'd heard of Bancroft, but not Kemble. Of course, he doesn't have a library named after him, but Gary, maybe you could speak to the Kemble occasional and the way that he's immortalized. And I assume that that's meant to be the Ramage in the letterhead for the Kemble occasional.
Yes, it is. And, Kemble was critically important because he wrote the history of newspapers in California up until 1856, which really did take into almost the whole history of printing in California, beginning with Zamorano and up to 1856. And again, George Harding seriously investigated Kemble and again, named his collection in his honor. So his name does live on, and he started a wonderful periodical, an occasional, issued, as they say, every now and then, called the Kemble Occasional, and again, devoted to California printing history. So Kemble's name certainly does live on. And in the new location of the California Historical Society, I might be wrong on this, but I don't think they have a separate room devoted to the Kemble collection anymore. They have to fit all these programs into different spaces. So, but his name does live on that way. So, and again, I recommend very highly his History of California newspapers. That was actually first printed in the Alta California, and it's probably one of the longest articles ever written because it was 35 columns of type. And you know, a lot of words, but it's such a great, great history. And he used so many of these people personally too. So you know, his contributions need to be recognized. And very, very important for saving printing and newspaper history in California.
There was also a question and observation early on that Monterrey is spelled on the title page with a double R, like the capital of the Mexican state of Nuevo León. And there were some orthographical shifts Gerald mentioned in Spanish, in the way that Spanish was spelled at this time. But I had an idle speculation that Gerald also mentioned, which is, why did the Universidad de Nuevo León choose to purchase that particular copy? And I wondered if somebody back there at a certain time just assumed that it had been printed actually there instead of in Monterey, California. But Gerald's wonderful, wonderful work to start that census, you know, might actually uncover the answer to that question. And I'm not sure when, Jose, you're going to cut us off, but we had a couple of other interesting questions about the reception of Zamorano's publications. And I think, you know, part of the reason that this panel was assembled was to maybe correct the under reception or the lack of knowledge that I think many people in these allied fields have about these California imprints.
Well, a key factor to consider is on January 24th, 1848, gold was discovered. And that just kind of upset the whole environment of California, and it really changed thinking about you know, what was going on, and you know, slight recognition of the Spanish-Mexican period, but you know, there's gold, 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 and we got to get it. And you know, that just so transformed California and just really changed the whole emphasis. That's just my opinion on things.
Kirsten, just to answer your question, I think we have time for one more question. So if there is one in the chat or in the Q&A, or that somebody would like to ask now, I think that would be good. Yeah.
It's great. I was just going to say, by way of reception and tracking genealogies, that Zamorano believed in the education of women, and his daughter Guadalupe was one of the very well-educated women of early California. And among Zamorano's many descendants are the Chicana musical icon Linda Ronstadt on the left, and the most famous poet that El Salvador has ever produced, Roque Dalton, on the right. So that's my pitch to connect this this work to students. Are there any other last questions? I think we've done fairly well with the remarks in the Q&A. Anything else in the chat, or any last remarks from our wonderful panelists?
This has just been very exciting to be participating in this.
Definitely.
Thank you for all your work, Kirsten.
It'll sound like a shameless plug for the Bibliographical Society, but it is. This kind of bibliographical work doesn't get done in isolation. And I've already thanked 27 times the many, many people who helped me, but we're all standing on the shoulders of giants like Bancroft and Robert Cowan and Gary Kurtz, for that matter, who helped me tremendously with this piece. And that's how this kind of research gets done, I think. And the Bibliographical Society has always supported it, and I'm glad to be part of this community. So thanks to the BSA.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, certainly, before we all sign off, I just want to give my own thanks to Kirsten, Gary, Teresa, and Gerald for your fantastic presentations today. I learned a lot, and certainly look forward to learning more about that census as it develops. And so, yeah, thank you again. Thank you to our attendees who have stuck around with us. And we hope you'll join us for more presentations during Bib Week. They are available on the Bibliographical Society of America's website, bibsocamber.org. And so with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoons. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So long.
Privilege. It's a privilege.